What is bad art, and how do we define it? At a glance, this might seem like an easy question to answer. We can almost instinctively tell if we do or don't like something, so it should follow that we can easily classify what is good and bad. Bad is a term that we use on a daily basis which we almost never pay very close attention to. It's a quick and easy shorthand that can describe anything from people to art. For example, we might say that a movie we saw last night was bad, or that someone is a bad person because of something they did, or we did bad on a test for failing to answer the questions properly. Because the term is so widely used, the expectation is that it would be easy to pinpoint what exactly bad means in any context, including that of art. But upon closer inspection, this exercise proves to be more complicated than what we might originally think. It's important to first establish that bad is not a useful title to describe art, because bad doesn't really mean anything. Bad is a subjective judgment we make to describe things that we do or don't like. And just because someone would call a specific artwork bad does not mean that other people feel the same way. When we say, for example, a painting is bad, what is generally meant is that the artwork fails to meet the traditional criteria for what a successful painting should be. Art within a Western setting has traditionally been used as a method of representation, and the quality of representation is dictated by a set of criteria that include things like composition, anatomy, perspective, color, line, and light. Fine art for a long time has been dominated by this criteria. However, if you've ever stepped into a contemporary art gallery, you will know that art has evolved to look nothing like it has in the past. Whereas previously, fine art was unmistakably linked with naturalism and representation, in today's modern climate, quite literally anything can pass as art. The bounds for what constitutes art are now practically non-existent. Art can be mechanically reproduced, it can be abstract to the point of being barely recognizable as the object it's depicting, it can be produced with the intent of disgusting the audience, and in some cases, it can even exist as only an idea. Our current complex landscape requires a new set of criteria by which we can judge art, because the traditional criteria used to define good art is no longer applicable. This then raises the question, is it necessary for an artist to possess advanced technical skill in order to create what we might describe as good art? I think the answer should be that art has no bounds, and that advanced technical skill on the part of the artist is not a necessary condition for creating great art. Marcel Duchamp famously made the argument that ideas are as important to art as what can be seen, an argument that shaped the artistic landscape of the 20th century. According to Duchamp, art is as much a cerebral experience as it is a visual one, meaning that great art does not only have to have a visual component to it, but also an idea, a concept for the audience to think about. Duchamp's own ready-made artworks embody this concept well, particularly 1917's fountain and 1913's bicycle wheel, which Duchamp himself insisted had no aesthetic value. It's not the physical works themselves or how they look that's important, but rather it's the ideas and questions that they propose that are. These works ask the audience to think about what exactly the artwork is. Is it the objects themselves? Is it the act of placing these objects within an artistic context? Or is it the reactions the pieces receive that is the art? There is no definite answer, and it's the questions the works raise that make them so interesting. This art of ideas is one that would influence the direction of art making since, and countless examples of works that are more focused on ideas rather than representation exist. Art as a concept is notoriously difficult to define. For thousands of years, philosophers and artists have tried their best to strike at the core of what art is. Historical definitions focused on the representational qualities of art. The better an artwork is at representing realistic figures, the better the art is. Some philosophers insisted that personal enjoyment was a necessary quality of a good artwork. Perhaps the most famous example of this is David Hume, who in his essay Of the Standards of Taste argued that any judgment made on the quality of an artwork is really an expression of the observer's taste. According to Hume, there does not exist such a thing as objectively good or bad art, only art that an observer does or does not like. More recently, however, Particularly within the past 60 years, the way we describe art has drastically changed. Though there is no universally agreed upon definition, there do exist different branches of thought that have created their own working definitions of art. The most compelling of these is not one isolated school of thought, but rather a hybrid that combines different ways of thinking into one definition. Each school of thought has its own set of unique beliefs and drawbacks, and in combining them all, it's possible to include the best aspects of each definition while steering clear of their drawbacks. One such definition was established by Arthur Dando, but best summed up by Noel Carroll, who wrote that something is a work of art if and only if 1. It has a subject, 2. About which it projects some attitude or point of view, has a style, 3. By means of rhetorical ellipses, generally metaphorical, 4. Which ellipses, in turn, engages audience participation in filling in what is missing, interpretation, and 5. Where the work in question and the interpretations thereof require an art historical context. This definition is quite wordy and not without criticism, though essentially what is being said is that something is art if an audience can engage with it, it presents a subject, and it has something to say about said subject. This definition is useful because it's broad enough to include art in all of its different facets while also placing limits and saying that not necessarily everything is art. The biggest drawback to this definition is that it assumes all art must by necessity be about something, which in of itself is a whole separate debate with conflicting opinions. However, if we accept Dando's definition as being true, if not the closest approximation to a true definition of art, then visual merit and technical skill would be irrelevant criteria for determining whether or not something is art. This means that a better term for what is commonly referred to as bad art might instead be ugly art, or just art that doesn't speak to you specifically, which does not automatically detract from the work or make it inferior to another work. So why are so many people inclined to believe that ugly art and bad art are synonymous with one another? There's a long-standing relationship between visual merit and what is generally thought of as good art. Earlier I mentioned the traditional criteria for good art, things like line, composition, color, and so on. This criteria didn't spring from nowhere. In fact, this criteria was selectively and deliberately chosen by art academies in Europe, which sought to define and regulate the creation of what they deemed to be good art. Having been around for centuries, art academies were at the height of their popularity during the 18th century. Academies fulfilled a long list of different roles, the obvious one being that they taught their student body how to draw and how to paint. During their inception, they worked to elevate the status of artist, which in previous ages had been thought of closer to an artisan. More importantly, however, academies were political tools used by the respective governments to promote the idea of strength and stability among its population. The idea was that the elite could spread their ideology through art, indoctrinating its population with the message that their government was strong and noble by imitating the imagery of what was perceived as strong, ideal civilizations, particularly Rome and Greece, positioning their country as being an echo of some glorious past. Members and graduates were expected to perpetuate the traditions and ideals of the academy, further spreading their influence and reach across Europe. Because of their vast power and influence, the academy dominated the field of art making for centuries, spreading their ideology, which eventually trickled down and reached an audience of people so wide that even those unfamiliar with art know how the academy would define good art, even if they themselves are not conscious of the fact that this definition was planted in their head by an elite institution. Within the context of the academy, it makes sense that pieces should be valued by their formal qualities. The academy has historically, as well as presently, favored specific qualities over others. Artists have for a long time pushed back on the standards set by the academy, arguing that their dominance on Western art worlds are restrictive and work to stifle the creativity of artists. While it's undoubtedly true that the works created by artists working within the academy are great works, masterpieces even, there is a reason why the academy is no longer upheld as the most important force within the art world. Nonetheless, the damage has been done, and still today, even when the term academic art is seen as an insult, there still exists an expectation for art to be visually pleasing in some way. So then, why do we continue to talk about certain works as being good or bad? The term bad is misleading because it doesn't necessarily mean that the artwork itself is fundamentally flawed, though that doesn't mean that art is beyond criticism, but rather, bad is a personal appraisal made by the individual as a means of effectively communicating to an audience their opinions on a specific work. In a world where the category of art is as broad as it is, it's wrong to say that any work is objectively bad, but rather, it's something that fails to speak to you. Taste and opinion is a subjective experience, and even though there might be a considerable amount of overlap between the opinions of different people within specific cultures, our exact personal taste will be, at the very least, slightly different from that of our peers. We all judge art by our own set of criteria. Some people greatly value the visual qualities of a piece. According to their criteria, it may be necessary for a piece to display advanced technical skill or that it look a certain way. These are some of the criteria that a person may use when appraising an artwork, though these criteria are subjective, and ultimately, they reveal less about the artwork itself and more about the individual interacting with the artwork.